How many people here have used Grasshopper? A few, and everyone else has never used it at all? Okay. So I guess I'll just start by saying, I think we probably all know this, but Grasshopper, right, is a plugin for Rhino, so you sort of operate it in it from within Rhino. Once you download it and install it, it's just a command in Rhino that sort of opens Grasshopper. And I guess just to maybe back up just a little bit. So Grasshopper is a parametric modeler. So what that means is you're essentially providing it inputs or parameters. You're manipulating those inputs, those parameters in some way, and you're generating an output. So in essence, it's a big equation, a big fancy, very beautifully graphic equation where you feed things in and things sort of come out. I think it's always important to remember that when you're using it, especially just so that you always make sure that you sort of maintain your agency as a designer and as an architect, and don't rely on Grasshopper to design. I mean, it can help you explore things and it can help you quickly manipulate large sets of data, but ultimately it's a computer and it doesn't know how to design. So just sort of keep that in mind. And so essentially the way that it works is that to some degree or another, you're going to sort of link it with geometry that exists in Rhino. It's going to manipulate that geometry, and then you're going to sort of take that geometry back from Grasshopper into Rhino, and we'll talk about this, but that's called baking. So in general, while you're sort of manipulating all of these sorts of things, that only exists in Grasshopper, and you can pick sort of the moments in this chain of data where you transfer it sort of back from the little Grasshopper world into Rhino. So does anyone have any questions about any of that? I know that's the most basic.
So it's like it's in real time?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's in as real time as, I mean, depending on how complex your sort of Grasshopper solution gets, it could take seconds or minutes to update each time that you're sort of making a change. So everything that we're going to do today is going to be really simple. So it's going to happen sort of in real time. Like the Grasshopper sort of file that I use in Chris Height Studio got ridiculously complex by the end, and so it would take a little while for it to sort of churn through all the calculations. So so basically, when you first open Grasshopper, you're going to see a blank canvas, right? So this is called the canvas. Across the top, you have all of these icons, which will create what are called components. So each little thing that you see in Grasshopper, each one of these little things is a component. And you're going to link components together. So just keep in mind that if you hear me say component, I'm just talking about one of these things. In general, the components are grouped into these, whatever, 8 or 10 sort of categories. So parameters, generally, this is going to be all of your inputs. So this group of parameters is going to let you link to geometry that exists in Rhino. And then sort of the rest of these are going to let you specify it sort of manually. Like, say, you might specify the number 10. That's one of the parameters. Then there's a bunch of other tabs. A lot of them are pretty self-evident. Math, sets, vectors, curves, surfaces, mesh, blah, blah, blah. So what I'm going to try to do today is not necessarily teach you what every single component does. A lot of them I think are pretty self-evident, and most of them work in a way that's very similar to the way that a command might work in Rhino. So for instance, under transform, we have move, right? So it's asking us, and we'll go through this, but it's going to work pretty similarly. So let's go ahead and create a simple curve in Rhino. So we're going to link that curve into Grasshopper. So to do that, we can right-click on this curve component, which, if you remember, I got it from the geometry sort of little box there. And we're going to say set one curve. So in basically these two commands, set one or set multiple, are the way that you link Rhino geometry into Grasshopper. So in this case, we're just going to set one curve. We'll click on that curve, and now it's in Grasshopper. So you see now we get this sort of red overlay over it, and if I select this component, it turns green. That sort of is a graphic representation of what's going on. So we're just actually going to start by making us just the most basic thing that we can do is move something. So this component has two inputs. If you mouse over an input, it's going to tell you what it's looking for. So the first thing it's looking for is a geometry. So it can be any geometry. It can be a curve. It can be a surface. It can be a point. It can be an arc. It can be any type of geometry. So essentially, it's asking us for the curve. So we'll draw or sort of drag from this little point, which is this component's output, to that point, which is this component's input. Okay? Make sense? Pretty easy. So the next one is looking for a vector. So this is essentially the translation vector. What direction should it's asking what direction should I move it and how far should I move it, and all that data is sort of contained in a vector. So we can go to the vector tab, and for right now we're just going to move it along the x-axis. So here in sort of the vector subgroup, there's this, which is called the unit x vector, which basically is a vector that's just pure x. And actually, if we sort of hover over the output, you see how it sort of gives you the sort of three vector components in x, y, and z. So it's going to move it 1 unit x and then 0 units y and z. So if we feed this in to the t, you can see now the green curve represents the sort of the output, right? And notice that I can't actually select that in Rhino, right? It doesn't exist in Rhino yet. So if I wanted to sort of create that in Rhino, I'd select this component, I'd right-click on it, and I'd click Bake. And this actually is going to give you sort of a menu that you can also select a component, and unfortunately they've like rearranged a bunch of stuff. They actually have, in the very newest versions of Grasshopper, they have this little thing that you can press the spacebar that pops up. The bake component used to be essentially right here. So I think on all this, probably the school versions of theirs, and if you're using an older version of Rhino, you might have to get an old version of Grasshopper. So the bake component will be right there, and it looks like a scramble or like an over EVA. So it's baked, and so now you can see that curve exists in Rhino, and if I wanted to move it in Rhino, it now exists there. But again, see how this now, because I baked it, is separate from what's happening in Grasshopper. So does that all sort of make sense? So of course, a lot of times we're not just going to want to do a simple 1 unit move in the x direction. We might want to have control over how far that can go. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to just specify the number manually. And you can do that most easily with a panel. So we'll double click on the panel and we'll say 10 units. We'll feed that into here. Now you see it's moved 10 units. I really only use panels when I know that this number is never ever going to change. I prefer to use one of two other types of sort of number inputs. The easiest one is the number slider. So with this slider, if you double click on it, here where it says slider, you can sort of set its bound. So here, let's just give ourselves from 0 to 10. We can feed this in, and now we can sort of control what's happening. And what's nice about this is we can begin, if we had a lot of other things going on in the model, we can begin to use this to make design decisions.
Where did the move component come from? Is that under transform?
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, the best way to find components, even after using Grasshopper for a long time, I can never remember where anything is. If you double click anywhere in the canvas, the little search thing comes up, and you can just start typing a command, and it's going to bring up all of the sort of things that things might be somewhat related. No, not as far as I'm aware of. So this is the sort of double click and search is really the best way to find stuff. And most everything that you're going to use in Grasshopper is going to be called the same thing that it's called in Rhino. So there's there's sweep, there's loft. All of those commands are the same name. So I hardly ever go searching for stuff here just because it's like completely impossible to find.
So once you bake it, it's no longer attached, connected.
Right.
Functionally?
Right. That sort of specific instance is no longer attached, but it still, of course, exists in Grasshopper. So if you wanted to continue to manipulate it, like let's say that we wanted to, the next thing was a rotate. I'm just going quickly. I can explain this more later, right? So, yeah. So if we bake this, sorry, I wrote too fast. Right? So it exists in Rhino, but if we, as we begin to like manipulate it over here, it still stays there. This one that we baked, right? Does that answer your question? No?
Yeah, no, that answers it.
Okay.
So the number slider can be connected to multiple
Yes.
components?
Right, which I'm just doing, I mean, in this case, it becomes like incredibly arbitrary what I'm doing.
Right.
I just wanted to sort of show you
Yeah.
what would happen. And so again, if we bake this component, it's going to bake that line. So, I mean, more or less, what you're going to do is you're going to sort of, when I'm sort of working, what I sort of do is at each step, right, I sort of know where I'm starting and I know that where I want to get to. And so at each step, I'm sort of looking at what's happening, and sometimes if something's happening screwy, I might bake it at that step, try to figure out what sorts of geometries it's creating. But ultimately, I'm really getting all the way to the end, and there's one object or one group of objects that I'm going to bake at the end. And I guess one thing that we should talk about at this point is sort of visibility and visibility of objects. So right now, right, we see this, and we see this in the sort of Rhino output. And generally, what I prefer to do is have really only the last component visible. So if you click any component, and you click this little like blindfolded guy, now you see that we don't get the little red line over the original. And again, we can turn this guy off. So we're really only dealing with, I prefer really only to deal with the sort of the last one in the string, because it becomes, when you've got 50 steps, if you see each step, it's hard for you to really keep track of what's happening, I find. So again, if you have a new version of Grasshopper, select something, hit the space bar, hit the blindfold. Otherwise, the blindfold is like in this area again on that toolbar. So does that make sense? Another thing, I guess I'm just going to talk quickly about like managing all these components, which again, we have 5 here, so it's easy for us to figure out what's going on. If we have 50, it'd be difficult. One thing that we can do is if we right click on any sort of slider, we can rename it. So maybe we'll call this one spacing, so that we remember when we come back to it what this is actually changing. We can also right click on a component itself and rename it, which you notice it doesn't actually change anything here. This little button here controls what is displayed on this component. So this means it's going to use the application setting. Don't worry about that. If you click it the first time, it will always draw its name. You see this little text symbol. So that way we can always sort of know what's happening here. So if your solution had 10 different inputs, it would be nice for you to label them so that you knew when you came back to it, okay, well this is this thing, so if I want to select a different sort of base geometry, I know what I'm doing, as opposed to sort of having to sort it out. And then the final thing that I'll point out is if you select multiple objects, in the new version of Grasshopper, you press the space bar and hit the group button. I think in older versions of Grasshopper, that also is either around here or it's maybe in one of these menus, I think under the Arrange menu. But anyway, you can group objects, and now they're sort of linked together. And you can actually right-click on this group and give it a name as well. So I really like trying to keep these things as organized as possible. I know it's really hard to do sometimes when you're scrambling to get some stuff done, but the sooner that you can sort of make notes to yourself in one of these files, the better it will be, so that if you need to come back to it and make changes, you know what's going on. And also,